Anwar, did you start the recording?
No, but I just heard it saying reporting in progress.
Yeah, I was just curious if it automatically did, which is totally fine regardless.
I'm gonna click on it again just in case, because oh no, it looks like it's already doing it.
Yep, it's recording.
All right,
Perfect.
welcome everyone. We're gonna get started right at 11. I see people are entering into the webinar little by little, so welcome. If you wanna, in the meantime, introduce yourself, maybe in the chat, what college you're from, anything exciting you're doing in spring break? I know everyone's spring break is at different times. In our at Saddleback College, we ended ours 2 weeks ago now.
I think that's right.
So welcome everyone.
Really quickly, Richard, could you turn your camera on just so I could spotlight you and then you can go off? Add spotlight. Perfect. We're good. So then during the transition, it will function accordingly. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. For those of you who just joined, feel free to add your name and what college you're from in the chat. We'll be getting started right at 11 in less than a minute. All right, it's 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining to today's webinar titled A Template for Disciplinary Reflection in the Age of AI. My name is Dr. Anwar Hijaz. I'm a political science faculty member at Saddleback College and a faculty mentor for the CVC at One. It is my pleasure to introduce our amazing facilitator today, Dr. Spencer Robbins. And he will introduce himself in more depth in just a few moments. I just want to share a few announcements before we get started. During today's webinar, we will share a survey in the chat near the end of the session. Your feedback is incredibly valuable and really helps CVC to help improve and design programming that better meets the needs of our colleges and systems. So we really appreciate if you could just take a few minutes. It doesn't take more than 2 to 3 minutes to complete the survey. I would like to also extend a special thank you to our ASL interpreters for being here today. We deeply appreciate your support in helping making this session accessible and inclusive for all our participants. If you need proof of attendance for flex credit or professional advancement, please stay till the end of this webinar, complete the survey, and request a copy of your responses in the form of the Google form. And you can use that as documentation for your attendance. And then for the best webinar experience, we recommend using full screen mode in Zoom. You can also adjust the size of the video or shared screen at any time using the scroll bar on your screen. Thank you so much again for being here. I will turn it to you, Spencer.
Thank you so much, Anwar, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm excited to share a little bit about our experience in the Saddleback College Department of English, which is where I'm from, and I'll say that again in a minute. Trying to think through essentially what our discipline means and what our discipline teaches in an age increasingly defined by the rise of AI tools. So disciplinary reflection in the AI age, that's the title for this presentation. And I'm always conscious when talking about these issues that, people are at very different places in their thinking about AI in their teaching. So I've tried to make this accessible to everyone and useful to everyone. But if you feel like there are questions I'm not answering, please feel free to ask those in the chat and I'll try to address them as we go. And if you feel like you're way ahead of me on this stuff, that's probably true because I'm constantly learning about these issues as we go. So in case this picture of me is not enough, here's another picture of me. My name is Spencer Robbins, and as I said, I'm an English instructor in the English department at Saddleback College in South Orange County in Mission Viejo. Um, and I guess the other relevant piece of information there is that for the past year, I've been a co-chair of our department's quote unquote AI task force, which is just a group of faculty members who committed themselves at the beginning of the year to trying to learn as much as possible about AI tools and to think as carefully as possible about their impact on our teaching. And that's what I'll be talking about in this presentation. So I think a question that all of us have been wrestling with for the past couple of years is, does the rise of these tools require us to change the way we teach, to change the instructional methods we use? And I think the answer to that question is a pretty unambiguous yes. But the question that I want to raise in this presentation, in this talk, is in some ways to me the next step beyond that question. We've spent a lot of time thinking about the how. I think the question that our department is now wrestling with is the what. Does the rise of AI tools actually change what we should teach in our classes? Does it change our understanding of our own disciplinary goals? So some of the broad questions that I'm going to be thinking and talking about today include, how should we think, each of us in our own disciplines, how should we think about the specific skills and knowledge that define our discipline, given the rise of AI tools that in some cases can reproduce those skills or deliver that knowledge? What are the core, given that change, what are the core skills and concepts that each of our disciplines feels remain important, that we need to defend against the temptations of AI shortcuts, the temptations students have to avoid learning those skills or ideas? For each of us, are there new skills that students need to interact with AI tools that are relevant to our discipline that we could potentially be teaching? And also, are there older skills that we've been teaching for a long time that maybe are not as important to our disciplines anymore and that we should think about de-emphasizing? So essentially, what do we want to keep and what do we want to change? And then finally, once we get a clearer sense of what the skills and concepts we want to focus on are, how might targeted use of AI tools help us teach students those skills and knowledge and values? So those are the broad questions. Specifically, I'd like to very briefly sort of tell the story of the Saddleback English Department's thinking about these questions. I'd like to go through a more detailed list of some of the disciplinary questions we've been asking. And I keep using the word disciplinary because I think what I want to stress is, obviously we teach in different disciplines, and I think our answers to these questions will differ from discipline to discipline. Different disciplines are going to have different ways of responding to and changing in response to these tools. And so my hope in telling our story is not to say you in your various disciplines need to ask the exact same questions, but that these questions can be models for similar conversations in other departments. And then I'll talk a little bit about some applications of these questions. So now that our department has started to think these through, it's led us to make some pretty significant changes in our assessment practices. It led to a process of rewriting our student learning objectives for our classes, student learning outcomes. And it's led us to start, in some cases, adopting and building our own interesting AI tools to help us address some of these skills and ideas. So, okay, let me start by just briefly talking a little bit about my experience in the Saddleback English department, or the English department at Saddleback College. So step one, act one of this story, total despair. I don't know how you all felt at the beginning of this year, but I felt bad, very, very bad about my classes. I saw a huge uptick at the beginning of this school year in particular, so in fall 2025, in what I would describe essentially as AI cheating. Students seeming to try to avoid almost any assignment I gave them, almost any skill I asked them to practice, by asking an AI tool to do it instead. And I did have a moment at the beginning of this year where it sort of felt like my classes just didn't work anymore. They simply weren't teaching what I needed them to teach. And, it was a very hard moment until I started talking to colleagues, realizing that a lot of people were in the same situation, and we decided to sort of throw resources behind this problem. And so we formed what we call the Saddleback English Department AI Task Force. I think the word name task force is a little ridiculous. We were required to call it that. We wanted to call it a work group, but there's rules about what you can call a work group. So we had to go with task force. But basically, we asked a number of faculty in our department to volunteer to be part of a group, a team that would take on the responsibility of learning as much as possible about AI tools, learning as much as possible about student use of AI tools, learning as much as possible about other institutions, adaptation strategies, and essentially bringing these to the department. And pretty quickly, what we realized was that we had to divide our conversation into two tracks, short term and long term, because a lot of people were in the situation I was in, feeling a lot of despair and concern about the structure of their classes. And so we needed to deliver some short term help to people in that situation. So one of the things we needed to research what are the most immediate and impactful changes that we can make to discourage inappropriate AI use and encourage teachers to be creative and innovative in responding to these tools and using these tools in their classes. This is the part I'm not going to talk as much about today. I will briefly mention that we did things like try to figure out best practices for writing syllabus policies, try to develop at least semi-standardized procedures for responding to inappropriate AI use, try to train faculty who didn't feel equipped to respond to what they saw as inappropriate AI use and how to do that. We tried to develop some basic lesson plans on AI literacy that could be shared across the department. And we started experimenting with changes in course structure, especially online. For example, we're piloting some hybrid modality courses coming up in the fall to try to create more face-to-face interaction with our online students. But at the same time, we also realized that that kind of short-term approach wasn't enough. And that, again, the rise of tools that can simply do many of the things that we ask our students to do, that can reproduce many of the skills that we ask our students to practice, really raises fundamental questions about the value of those skills. Essentially, if a machine can do it, what's the value in teaching a student to do it? I think is the core question that we needed to think through in terms of what we teach in our department. So we have been trying to have this longer term conversation about how and what we teach. And the how, I'll say again, we've been experimenting with new forms of new modalities for instruction. I think this problem has been especially acute in online classes. So one thing we've been experimenting with is restructuring online classes to include regular one-on-one face-to-face meetings between instructors and students, piloting, like I said, hybrid modality classes where students come in maybe once a month or a couple times a semester. We're going to start those in the fall, including oral assessments in online classes as opposed to traditional online exams, etc. But again, and sorry, this is a very long introduction, I guess, because this is all build up to this deeper question of, okay, but what about the what? Like, what are we even teaching? And what is the value of what we're teaching if it is now machine reproducible? I think that's the fundamental question that we have been trying to think through what it means for our teaching in more detail. So real philosophical here. This is why I started with the painting of Plato. What do we teach and why do we teach it, right? And how do our answers to those questions change given the rise of AI tools? So one thing that we immediately started thinking about was there's a whole suite of skills that we teach in English classes and that are reflected in various ways in our documentation of those classes, SLOs being a prime example. And they're on a spectrum in terms of cognitive complexity. So we teach things like argumentation. That's really core to the composition classes that an English department teaches. How do you stake a claim in an ongoing debate? How do you support that claim with evidence drawn from different kinds of sources? How do you evaluate those sources? How do you phrase your claim to be as clear as possible? How do you outline the steps of an argument that supports the constituent parts of that claim?
I'm sorry. Can you slow down just a little bit?
Absolutely. Sorry about
Thank you so much.
that. Of course. So argument is a core skill that we teach. On the other hand, we also teach, I don't know what the word to use here. I'm tempted to say more basic logistical skills like formatting a paper, for instance. Or, well, we'll talk about what belongs in which category. So it was helpful for us to start differentiating between the skills, like I would argue, argumentation that are at the very core of what we want students to learn, versus skills that are more peripheral, like how to format a paper, which is, I think, not central. It's something we've taught traditionally. In fact, it's something we've spent a lot of time teaching, things like MLA or APA formatting. But I think in our judgment, that turned out to be less core to our understanding of our discipline. Another helpful, I think, so core versus periphery, I think is a helpful question to bring to these conversations. I think another helpful one is content versus skills. So to what extent is a class focused on delivering knowledge that students can then reproduce versus to what extent is a class about asking students to learn to do something they weren't previously able to do. I think it's very common for people to say that a class, for example, teaches critical thinking skills, but actually trying to list what those are in a given class and be more concrete about, like, for example, if one of the core skills in our discipline is argumentation, then skills like finding sources, evaluating sources, citing sources, right? That would be like a more detailed list of some of the skills that we need to teach. And then we also found it helpful to throw the word values into the mix. To what extent are our classes about modeling or teaching certain kinds of humanistic values like curiosity or inquiry or responsibility to one's community, things like that? Are those things that we want to foreground as constituent elements of our discipline? And you've probably heard some version of this before, but a helpful thought exercise that people often share to spur these conversations is the 5 or 10-year test, right? Your students are very unlikely to remember most of what you say or teach in a class 5 years from now. So what are the things you would most want them to remember? Can you write down a list of sort of like the 5 key takeaways? I like expanding the time frame. What will they remember in 5 years? What will they remember in 10 years? What will they remember in 50 years? To try to help you identify what the real core of what you're trying to teach is. Another, I've said this already, but I think it's worth emphasizing. I think this is a really crucial question. It was for us. The English as a discipline teaches writing, but there are now machines that can produce pieces of writing to pretty detailed specifications. So what is the value of teaching writing when it is far more machine reproducible than it used to be? And this is important because a lot of how we define the goal of a class, traditionally, at least for us, had to do with outcomes. Like we used to say, at the end of this class, you will be able to write a college paper, for example. But if the outcome is now much easier to produce, maybe defining the goal in terms of the outcome or the product is not as valuable anymore. And in fact, maybe if you think in terms of skills instead of product, maybe there are ways to teach those skills that do not involve some of the traditional products of your discipline. So you can maintain the core while changing what you're measuring. So again, thinking a little bit bigger picture instead of, say, writing a college paper, thinking about what are the habits of mind, the cognitive skills that went into writing college papers that maybe don't as much anymore, and how can we assess those skills directly instead of bundling them into this traditional product. But I did throw one other reminder on this slide because I don't want this to sound like anything AI can do is not worth teaching, because I don't think that's true. And I think a very important principle to remember is that the people who are the best users of AI tools are people who already have the knowledge and skills necessary to evaluate the AI's output, right? Like if I use AI, for example, to gather materials for a literature review, I have training to assess the quality of that literature review, the gaps, the assumptions, etc. If someone does not yet have that training, even though the AI can, quote unquote, can do it, they still need to be trained in those traditional skills to be effective users of the tool. So I just want to stress, it's not the case that if AI can do something, it's not worth learning to do anymore. But it is worth asking which things that AI can do are still worth learning how to do, because I think some are, and maybe some are less so. So that leads to, I think, another really helpful thought exercise. And I've seen people actually do this in the form of like a spreadsheet or a table, where a department will list all the ideas and skills and values that they think are important in their classes. And then you can go through and you can put like a plus, a slash, and a minus for more important, still important, less important, given that AI can do certain skills now. So you can go through and you can kind of think systematically. I'll give you an example. I have a friend who teaches statistics, and a huge portion of his class was about data visualization. Data visualization is something AIs can do very quickly now. So like taking data from an Excel spreadsheet and turning it into a chart or a graph. So he decided that the actual design of the visualization was a little bit less important, but understanding the relationship between the data and the visualization was still very important, right? So he was going through and kind of thinking about like which products do I maybe not need to focus on as much, which are still important, and which are arguably more important. And then that, I think, can lead you to the next pair of questions, which is once you're clear about which goals matter most, to then start assessing your assignments, activities, and assessment strategies. So having a student turn in a data visualization is maybe a less effective assessment given how easily that's done by AI. And so maybe something like explaining the reasoning behind the choices in the visualization becomes more important. So really starting to ask carefully, like which of these assignments, activities, and assessments are still serving our goals and which aren't. And I think this is where the conversation can get hard, because sometimes it can lead you away from things you've been doing for a long time. One of the themes of this talk, as you're going to see, is me hinting gradually that I think the college paper is maybe not the right container for a lot of the skills that we teach anymore. I've been teaching college papers for, I don't know, 15 years or something. The idea of setting aside that basic assessment structure is very, very challenging for me. And it's not like I'm doing it overnight. I still have papers in my classes, don't get me wrong. But I'm starting to think about ways to de-emphasize them, move away from them, and find other ways to assess the skills that I've used them as proxies for in the past. And then finally, I don't want to come across at all like this is all negative. I think that AI tools present amazing opportunities to actually teach some of these core skills better. And so once you have that list of like, what are the really core things we want students to take away, another question you can apply to them is which of these could be taught better through structured interaction with an AI tool? And at the same time, which of these need most to be protected, taught away from interaction with AI tools? Because I think different skills are absolutely going to fall in those two buckets. I believe very strongly there are days in my classes that are pencil and paper because students need to be thinking entirely on their own. And there are other days that are AI engaged because I think that there's a skill being practiced that day where structured interaction with an AI tool is very, very helpful. So really being intentional and thoughtful about which type of skill is best taught in which of those modes. Okay, so just to walk you through the version of this conversation we've been having in English, it's like back to basics. What does an English department teach? What's the purpose of taking English classes? And I'm going to run through different possible answers to that question. I don't think any of them are entirely right. I don't think any of them are entirely wrong. I want to show the kind of open-ended questioning I think we need to do. So one possible answer is we teach writing, and we teach writing for the sake of careers. People need to write in various careers, so we prepare them to do that. Well, right off the bat, that raises a tough disciplinary question. Are people going to be doing as much sentence by sentence writing in their careers? I'm sure we've all seen the rise of the AI generated email, right? It's not as clear that that's as important as a career, just defined in terms of career readiness. It's not clear that that's as important as it used to be. And even if it is, what exactly should the focus be? Is it correct grammatical sentences? Is it well-structured paragraphs? Is it the ideas behind the writing? Like, where should our focus be if our focus is career readiness? I'm not sure. This is an unsatisfying part of the presentation because you're not going to get any answers. This is just all the questions. So another version is, okay, is our department supposed to teach how to write a college paper? Is that really like the core skill of our discipline? I will say, I think in a lot of ways, and I'm sorry if this section is also the most about English. Don't worry, it won't be so English focused going forward. But um, in some ways, our discipline has kind of shrunk itself. I think over the years, we teach composition classes, and a lot of them really are just focused on the college paper. And we're starting to question that. Like, is that really the core skill, especially when it's much more easily reproducible now? Maybe there are other kinds of writing and thinking and communication that fall under English that we've lost sight of and could recover. And that might be more significant at a time when like grammatically correct formal prose is just not as impressive as it once was. So then that leads to questions about, okay, are there broader skills that we're supposed to teach? Something like literacy, writing and reading in a broader sense, not just for career readiness. I already mentioned argumentation and research. Um, I think it can get really interesting when you start to think about the skills a class can teach. For example, conversation, discussion, being in a room with people talking about ideas. Is that a skill that we can teach? And if so, should we be foregrounding it more in our objectives and assessments, as opposed to having our assessments be entirely about college papers, which they have been for a long time? I wanted to mention this one just because it's another major cultural shift we're going through. You may have read about the literacy crisis, declining reading rates, declining literacy rates are a major force in our social life right now. So is that sort of a vision for the future of our departments, that we're the place to go to ensure the continuation of adult literacy? Not, again, not just for career readiness, but literacy in a much broader sense, being able to read and write and think through complex texts and ideas. And finally, go big picture. Think about the values behind your discipline. Again, things like curiosity, inquiry, conversation, debate, disagreement across difference. One thing that, for example, a lot of liberal arts departments focus on in the past was a conscious discussion of ethics and the question of what kind of person a person wants to be, right? A lot of literary texts raise those sorts of questions. I'd say those have moved out of the core of our disciplinary focus in the last few decades. Maybe they need to come back in some ways. When I say maybe, I mean maybe. There are no answers to these questions yet. In fact, what I really want to stress is that to some degree, I think the answer is all of those things that we just said. We need to be attentive to students' career needs. We also need to be thinking about skills beyond career. We also need to be thinking about larger values. So it's not so much picking between them as letting them exist in productive tension and thinking about the ones that have been more our focus and the ones that could become more of our focus. So if we've drifted towards, again, narrowly defined lists of academic skills, like the college paper, maybe this is an opportunity to refocus the discipline elsewhere while still covering those important skills. So we did not answer those questions, but we did come to some decisions. I don't want to make it sound like it's just conversation. So here are a few things our department has been doing. Again, we've been trying to move beyond the college paper as the main unit of assessment and think creatively about other ways of assessing our core skills. We've decided to emphasize not just writing and composition, but reading and writing as part of a larger process of becoming literate. We've actually focused a lot more on reading as a core set of skills that we took for granted before, but now try to teach much more consciously. We started to de-emphasize certain skills that seem less important because AI can do them, and it's not clear that they correlate with other deeper skills. So things like correcting sentence errors. A lot of class time used to be devoted to like, here's a worksheet of wrong sentences, find the errors. And we're maybe spending less class time on that now, less time on formatting, etc. And embracing the value side of the question, trying to foreground our discipline's role in something like students' processes of self-making. So encouraging more ethical reflection in our classes and our assignments and our writing. Building in more assignments that require students to interact with their communities in ethical ways. Think about actions that they want to take in their communities, turn their research skills toward their communities, etc. And actually, I just thought of one that's not on a bullet point here, but but we've been incorporating a lot more primary and field research into our assignments as a way of encouraging students to take these skills out into the world, and to sort of make knowledge directly instead of only through secondary reading and research. Okay. Maybe a natural time to pause and just check in.
No questions so far. And I forgot to mention, feel free to add your questions in the chat, or there's also a Q&A option that you can enter your questions into as well.
Great. So yes, if people do have questions as we go, I'm certainly happy to pause, excuse me, and try to address those. But the next piece I wanted to talk about is, so concretely, what we've been doing is devoting more of our shared department time to these big picture questions. Maybe I should say, part of that has been, our department chairs have been sending out periodic surveys with questions like this. Like, we sent out a survey recently, for example, that said, what is the point of teaching writing when a computer can quote unquote write for you? And we just gathered people's thoughts about that. And then we used those thoughts at our next department meeting to have a conversation around that same question and to sort of look for points of potential consensus that we could come to as a department. So if there's one takeaway so far from this presentation, essentially what I'm saying is, I think departments across the California community colleges should be devoting time to these big picture disciplinary questions in their shared department time. Find ways to bring faculty together to discuss these questions. So the next step then is applications. So if you do start to, for example, come to some consensus about skills that are more important versus skills that are less important, given the rise of AI tools, how does that actually change your documentation, your activities, your teaching, your assessment practices? So I wanted to give a few examples of places where we've tried to pursue real change based on our answers to these questions. One is SLOs, our student learning outcomes. We recently came up against an opportunity to rewrite our SLOs. There was a deadline by which we could revise them. And we took a look at them and we realized that in a lot of ways, they felt like a record of an older department. They hadn't been updated in a while. And they embodied a list of values and skills that we actually felt were no longer the most relevant description of what we do or what we should do. And since we have to measure SLOs each year, they are a statement to your department, your faculty, and to anyone who accesses and reads them about what you intend to measure, and therefore what you intend to teach, and therefore what you think is important. So these are the old SLOs for our essentially introductory level English course, English C1000, our first level composition class. And I know this is a lot of text, but I think it is worth looking at these. The first one says, students who complete this course will be able to write an essay that contains an arguable thesis. The second one says, students will be able to write an essay that contains at least 900 words and develops the thesis through summary, analysis, and evaluation. The third says, students who complete this course will be able to write an essay that contains a variety of sentences that have no fragments, comma splices, or run-on sentences. And the last says, students who complete this course will be able to write an essay that integrates MLA standards for the following items, and then it lists 8 points of formatting. Anyone notice anything about these SLOs and what they emphasize? Sorry to be quizzing the chat. I can just talk about them, but if anyone has any observations. Product, yes. They're very product oriented, right? Several of them, exactly, product over process, focused on writing essays, right? They're all about, you're gonna write papers, and they define that paper largely in terms of things like length, right? Like the word count. There are some sort of deeper cognitive skills implied here, an arguable thesis, for example, and then the idea of summary, analysis, and evaluation. But there's nothing about process, thought process, writing process, etc. There's a lot about product. And I'll also throw in 2 of the 4 are about correcting sentence errors, right? So the variety of sentences one is basically don't have the following 3 types of errors: fragments, comma splices, and run-on sentences. And another one is entirely about formatting. So in terms of what this communicates about the department's focus and values, a student looking at this would think, okay, I've got to write a perfectly formatted, error-free essay with a certain number of words in it. And that, after our conversations, we realized that's just not what we want the core of this class or of our discipline to be. Not to say they won't be writing papers, not to say they won't have 900 words, not to say we won't, try to help them with grammar. But if that's the focus at this level of generality, the SLOs, I think that that's a missed opportunity. We all thought that. And so we went through a pretty intensive process to rewrite our SLOs. I will not read all of these, but I'll emphasize, responding to what the chat said, we put a lot more focus on process. For example, number 2, students will engage in a process of recursive planning, writing, and revision. We focused on sentences not in terms of errors, but in terms of creativity and experimentation. Like number 3, students will be able to make creative and effective choices in their use of language. We thought about values that we wanted to live up to, and authenticity came up a lot, right? In the AI age, like sounding like yourself, thinking about what you want to sound like. So number 4, students will develop an authentic authorial voice that reflects their values, identities, and/or communities. And then skills that we think are at the core of the discipline. So for example, number 1, students will demonstrate understanding of and the ability to analyze complex texts in different genres representing various forms of authority, reading and dealing with complexity. That to us is a core skill and a core value. So this was an intensive process to do this. It took a lot. But yes, and I just want to say, Todd, in the chat, was that ever what we really wanted for our students? Exactly, right? A lot of this is not change so much as it is clarifying values and commitments we already had. And Anne, thank you very much for your kind words. We're really proud of these. We think these are very reflective of the process that we've gone through. And we're much happier with the class that this new set of SLOs implies. So this, I think, is a place where, the rubber meets the road in terms of how do you define your skills, your values, how are you going to measure them, and therefore, what are you going to teach? So SLOs, that's a big one. Another one, is assessment. Because again, how do I want to put this? I think a lot of our traditional assessment practices worked because they were ways of measuring skills that we cared about. It wasn't the product we cared about, but the product was correlated with the skill. So like writing a college paper, was that ever the most important thing in an English class? Well, no, because 99.9% of our students are never going to write anything that looks like a college paper ever again in their lives or careers. And that was true 30 years ago. But the reason the college paper worked as a means of assessment was to write one, you had to do the underlying skills we did care about, like thinking about what you want to say, gathering evidence from sources, expressing yourself clearly, revising based on feedback. Those things matter, and the college paper used to measure them. Now, maybe it doesn't anymore. So you need to be clearer, I think, about what matters. Exactly, Leah. We have poor measures in place for what we really want from students. And AI is an opportunity, I think, to recognize that and say, okay, we actually haven't been measuring what matters, at least not directly. And now we have this huge force pushing us to try to measure it more directly instead of depending on these traditional correlates. So really taking seriously the possibility that there's a mismatch between your disciplinary goals and your assessment practices. And I'll give some examples of this. In addition to composition classes, I teach literature classes. What's the goal in a literature class? It's to get students to read complex literature closely and thoughtfully. How do you traditionally measure that? They write papers. Now, hold on. They write papers to measure their reading ability. right? There's a mismatch there. And I'm not saying that a paper can't reflect reading ability, but maybe it did before in a way that it doesn't necessarily as much now if you're not sure who wrote the paper. So the simple fact that the goal of the class is around reading and the assessment was entirely around writing suggests a mismatch that could be thought about critically. And so something that our department has been experimenting with is ways of capturing and measuring students' reading processes more directly. For example, using annotation software that can be integrated into Canvas, where students are making comments on particular points in a text. We've been doing a lot of video-based discussions instead of text-based discussions. Not that a student can't read off an AI script, nothing is perfect, but getting students to speak informally about their reading reactions instead of, yes, the book club style assessments are a wonderful example of this. Having students read on paper, annotate as they go, and share photos of their reading notes. In my in-person classes, when I assign whole books, we bring in our books and people hold up their books and show all the post-it notes, or they flip through the pages to show how they've marked them up, right? Kind of celebrating the physicality of the reading process and then using that as a way of measuring reading practices. So does my literature class lose something if I de-emphasize? I mean, I still have papers. I'm still doing those traditional assignments, but maybe I'm weighting them a little bit lower or they're a little bit shorter, and that gives me room for other assignments that get at my, at my goals more directly. And Anne raises this question about how to move beyond the traditional essay in an English class when we have things like Cal-Getzy guidelines to follow. And I think it is, what I'll say for now is, when I say move beyond, I don't mean abandon entirely. And so if the core, for example, requires a certain amount of writing, like by word count, which like many of our cores do, we're going to make sure students are doing that much writing. So we are always following those requirements, and we're always very careful to do that. But recognizing when there is more flexibility within those than might be immediately apparent. For example, defining writing to include things other than, there's things other than papers that students can write and share, for example. So I think you always have to be very careful to follow the guidelines, but you can also recognize when the guidelines do allow for creativity and experimentation. As another,
Sorry, I thought you had a pause. So there's a really important question that came in that from an anonymous person saying that I'm a part-timer and the full-time leadership in my department is not supporting these types of conversations. They are stuck in a punitive thinking and prevention strategies. Do you have any suggestions for how to challenge and resist outdated SLOs, CLOs, while without the protections of full-time status, and where to find communities of practice for this kind of work outside of our own campus? Very important question.
A very important question. And I should say I'm very privileged in this regard in that my department has sort of embraced this challenge. And I feel very lucky about that. And I'm very cognizant that that's not true for everybody. And also I am a full-time instructor. And so I do have those protections, and I'm very cognizant of that limitation as well. There are different directions, and I really encourage if other people in the chat or in the webinar have thoughts about this, because I feel limited in my capacity to address this question, though I will share a few thoughts. One, I think, is you can think rhetorically about, are there ways to raise these discussions that don't feel as challenging to people who might be more committed to like traditional modes of assessment? And I think, for example, I've been framing this as moving beyond the paper. Maybe that's not the right framing for a more traditionally minded department. Maybe it's how do we supplement the paper with other creative forms of assessment. So maybe some rhetorical maneuvering can be helpful there. Another, and without ever wanting to put yourself at risk, but again, recognizing where even fairly traditional SLOs, for example, do leave wiggle room. For example, I mean, just to get kind of concrete about this, if you look at our old SLOs, look carefully at how they're phrased. Students will be able to write an essay of 900 words with an arguable thesis. It's not saying that's the only assignment. It's certainly saying that is the assignment that's going to get measured. So you might have to have a more traditional looking assignment. But the way you scaffold up to that assignment, the other kinds of assignments and assessments you have around it, I think there is still room to innovate and experiment. And we had faculty, including part-time faculty, who were extremely innovative when the old SLOs were in place. That leads to a third point, which is to some extent lead by example, right? A lot of what happened was faculty with the old SLOs were doing more interesting things and more effective things. And over time, we started to recognize our best teachers, absolutely including part-time faculty, they're doing things that are not captured by these SLOs. So to some extent, rewriting the SLOs was catching up to our best instruction and our best instructors. And in terms of finding communities of practice, I will say a lot of my most exciting conversations around this stuff have been cross-disciplinary. So looking for opportunities to connect with faculty in other departments. If it doesn't feel like your department is giving you those opportunities, and maybe even at other campuses through events like this. So I know that's an inadequate answer to that really important question. And if anyone has other suggestions to add, I welcome them, but that's my best first attempt. And thank you for that question. I think I've covered this a lot already, but another example is the mismatch between the paper and the constituent skills that it's meant to measure. The way I've been thinking about this metaphorically is a paper is like a bundle of a lot of different skills. Maybe part of what we need to do is disaggregate those skills. Instead of measuring them through one big thing, measure them through small scaffolded things. So for example, if one of my key skills is that I want students to be able to analyze a source's reliability, instead of putting that on the rubric for the paper and assessing it when we get to the paper, can I assess it directly in a more targeted way during the scaffolding? So for example, having students share their annotations on a source, having them record a video where they discuss a source informally before they ever write about it, having students meet with me one-on-one. I've been doing a lot of mini conferencing to talk about a source before they ever write about it. So trying to measure the skill itself instead of bundling it with other skills into a larger assignment has been really helpful. Okay. And the last application that I wanted to discuss is once you have this more targeted sense of the specific skills and ideas that you want to teach, are there skills where students having structured, guided interactions with AI tools will actually help them learn those skills better? And I think the answer is yes. And so I'm going to give an example. An example of, I guess, my complete thought process on one skill is the way I'll frame this. And the skill is grammar. So does teaching, the question I started with is, traditionally, like I said, English classes have spent a lot of time on students identifying and correcting grammatical errors. You saw it in our old SLOs, like comma splices, sentence fragments, and run-ons. Does that approach to teaching grammar still matter in the AI age? And my honest answer is, I think correcting sentence errors gets a minus sign. I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all, but I think it matters less. It's not something I want to spend tons of class time on, when frankly, if you do struggle with comma splices, you can ask an AI to just identify comma splices in a piece of writing you've done. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all, but I think it's just not as important. That said, there are elements of grammar that I think still matter a lot. I'm a big fan of what's sometimes called generative grammar, kind of an ironic term in the AI age, but the idea is that learning sentence forms actually enables people to have new kinds of thoughts. If I know how to use a word like although one thing, comma, another is nevertheless true, that allows me to introduce subtleties into my thoughts that I might not have access to without that sentence form. So I think that's still very relevant, expanding the range of sentence forms that students are able to use to think, speak, and write. And identifying what is characteristic about the grammar and form of other people's writing, I think is maybe more relevant, because if one of the great career skills of our age is going to be evaluating AI output, being able to even talk about, for example, the sentence forms an AI has chosen to use and how you could prompt it for different sentence forms if you wanted to. If you don't know the forms, you can't do that evaluation. So some kinds of grammatical skills I think are less important. Some I think are still important. Some I think are more important. So how does this change my instruction? Well, one thing is it means I'm going to emphasize things like correcting errors less. Concretely, that meant taking off grammatical errors scores from rubrics or making them worth a very small number of points, because that's just not what I don't want to assess what doesn't matter. So de-emphasizing that in my assessments. In fact, quite the opposite. If I want students to be comfortable using a broader range of sentence forms, I want to encourage them to experiment. And experiment means being comfortable with failure. So I actually want to encourage students to try out sentence forms that might produce errors the first few times they try them. So I've been writing new process-oriented rubrics that say things like, did this paper use several different sentence forms regardless of success, right? Did you experiment with new ways of expressing your thoughts? So actually literally giving points for experiments that may not have worked. And finally, looking for opportunities for students to practice some of these core skills with AI-powered tools. And let me give you an example of a tool that I built. So here's an issue that comes up in a lot of my students' writing. In first drafts, they will often have paragraphs with no sentence breaks. They'll just have a sentence that goes on and on and on and on, just hurling thoughts at the reader with no period for a pause, like I did before. Sorry about that. I actually think this is not a problem. I think it's a good thing. I think when a student has a breathless paragraph long sentence, that's a clear sign that they have thoughts they're trying to get out. They're brainstorming and they're thinking about everything they want to say more than they are thinking about getting the sentence structure correct. I think that's all good, no problem. But it is hard to read. And it shows that they're not yet thinking about how to structure their sentences to be clear, to express the logical relationships between their ideas clearly. So a teaching goal I always have in my composition classes is helping students understand how to split a long breathless sentence up into clearer parts with logical connectors that express how the ideas are related. I want to be clear, the focus is on expressing ideas, not grammatical correctness. Now, this is a classic AI can do this. You can take a run-on sentence and you can put it in, Claude or ChatGPT or whatever and say, hey, can you introduce sentence divisions to make this easier to read? Absolutely, it can do it. But to me, it's still worth teaching students to do, because I think that this is a cognitively significant step in terms of expressing yourself, being clear about where your ideas stop and start and how they're related to each other. So my question is not, can AI do it for them? It's, can AI help them think through the problem of how to string together complex thoughts? And I think the answer is yes. So let me show you how I used to teach this. Classic teaching tool, worksheets. Yeah, worksheets, they have things like, if you look at the one on the top here, I wrote a run-on sentence that goes on for a whole paragraph, and I say rewrite this with new sentence divisions. There's also sentence combining worksheets where you have a bunch of short sentences that don't have logical connectors, and you ask students to add logical connectors. Now, this is a reasonably successful teaching method, I guess. It was limited in the number of examples I could give because I had to write them all and fit them all on a worksheet. And it was limited in the amount of feedback I could give because I'm not giving live feedback while students are working on them individually, except to the extent that I can walk around the classroom and read over their shoulders. So this is a targeted skill, where I think you can get creative about interactive AI-powered versions of something traditional like a worksheet. So what I did was I used Claude, in this case, an LLM, to help me create what I'm calling an interactive workspace instead of a worksheet in HTML code. So I say, can you help me do this where the output is HTML code that I can then copy paste directly onto a Canvas page, which can work with HTML. and then the student is just interacting with it live. I don't think this is perfect yet. Excuse me. And yes, Regina, that's a great middle step, having students circle the individual thoughts before they break them into sentences. And you can build an AI tool that lets them do that, right? That lets them, you know, I don't know, click and circle. There's different, you can really experiment with this. This is what's exciting about AI tools. To me, you know, a popular AI teaching technique right now is the sort of chatbot tutor, which I think is powerful in some ways, but those are designed to answer any question a student could ask about the course. I'm really excited about these targeted interactive tools that I build and then students practice with. So what this tool allows is the AI comes up with an example sentence, or I can write them and feed them into it. Either way is fine. That's a run-on. Then students scroll down and there's boxes where they can write their new sentences. They can add however many boxes they want. It encourages them to add logical connectors as they rewrite and divide those sentences. And then at the bottom, there's a button that says get feedback. And I wrote a very careful prompt telling the LLM how to give feedback. I said a lot of don't do's, like don't give feedback on the ideas, don't give feedback on the style, don't give opinionated feedback. Simply assess whether the choices they made and the connectors they used capture the implied logical relationships. If they did, call that out. If not, point out the missed opportunity. And you can read the kind of feedback that it gave. Now, this is not perfect. I think its feedback is actually written in language that's a little too advanced, and I'd like to tell it to dial its vocabulary down a little bit. But this is a great example where now instead of a worksheet, students can do as many of these examples as they want because the AI can continue to come up with examples. They can get live feedback, and I can still be there to guide them. So it's not the only feedback that they're getting. So I think this is significantly better than a worksheet because it's extendable. It can come up with more examples, and it frees up time for me to focus on, like, this to me is a useful skill, but it's not a core skill in my discipline. This is a more effective way to teach it, I think, so I can teach it faster and more impactfully and focus my human instruction on other core skills. Now, I'm aware of time. So the other thing I just want to stress is I think looking for opportunities like this has to be paired with clear thinking about when it is not a good idea to include AI interactions. So for example, I have an assignment in my classes where students tell a story from their life that reveals something about the community they come from and its values and their relationship to those values. I do not want them getting computer feedback on that kind of thinking. That feedback comes from me. But feedback on, did you capture all of the implied logical relationships with connectors? That maybe can come from an AI. And it frees me to focus my feedback on the place where the fact that it's a human relationship matters most. And what I'm most interested in is weaving these two approaches together. So going back and forth between human and AI feedback. So for example, human side, I want students to reflect with me and their classmates on the story they want to tell in that assignment. I want them to write their first drafts completely without AI. Then I want them to use those AI-powered practice spaces I've designed to practice restructuring their sentences and paragraphs. But I don't want the AI to do it for them. I then want them to take those skills back to their drafts and revise their sentences and paragraphs without AI guidance. So the AI is brought in strategically to make room for lots of human thought and interaction. Okay, I have a conclusion slide, but I'm going to skip it so that we have a few minutes for thoughts or questions at the end. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Anwar. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the interpreters.
Thank you so much, Spencer. I'm like in awe with how much I have to go back to my classes now. And, I'm really looking forward to like implementing a lot of the things that you just shared. And I see the claps and the hearts and so I know the feeling is very mutual amongst the attendees. And I want to thank everyone for being here today and attending. I just want to share a few announcements. Hopefully we'll have maybe like a minute for one question if there is one. But before everyone goes, please complete the survey that was dropped in the chat. This recording of the webinar and the slides will be posted on the CBC at One website. And like I mentioned, you can use the survey as proof of attendance, but if, of course, you've encountered any issues or have any questions, feel free to reach out to support@cbc.edu. I'm going to go ahead and drop the link to our webinar page. We have two more webinars in the series this semester. So if you were, we highly recommend you registering for any of those last two. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Spencer. And thank you to our ASL interpreters. We do have 2 minutes. So if anyone has a final question they want to drop in the chat or in the Q&A, we'll hang around.
I'll just say, Anwar, you mentioned feeling sort of excited and overwhelmed, right? I mean, it can be overwhelming to start these kinds of conversations and to feel like you're confronting this scale of change that's just huge. But I really want to, and believe me, I felt that way at the beginning of our department's process. But at the end of the day, it's really fun because it's an opportunity to clarify what you care about most and most want for your students. And I think once you embrace that, it's really satisfying. So I hope everybody takes the
I
opportunity.
just sit in on a few of your classes. This was wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
All right. I think there's just a lot of thanks and comments in the chat. So I think we'll go ahead and end on that positive note.
That's
Have a
great.
wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.